Welcome back. Welcome back to Living in Mexico. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank all of you who've been joining us since 2004. Can you believe that? It's always been it's always a pleasure to have you to know that you are joining us every weekend. So thank you so much. There's a lot of news. And as you heard from the top of the hour, there's a lot of news that has to do with it, with it has to do with the United States. It has to do with a lot of the security issues in Mexico. But this is a good time to just kind of step back and start trying to understand how the U.S. bilateral relationship has changed since Donald Trump took office. That's why I really appreciate Ivan Zapien. He's been joining us throughout the years. He's a political analyst. Ivan, you're in Washington right now. I don't know how does it feel? I mean, what's the environment? I mean, clearly, Donald Trump has been having a series of very successful programs. We may disagree with him, but he's actually been politically, he's been very successful. So the way he's treating Mexico, or his team is treating Mexico, has changed dramatically. I don't know. What's your view?
So that's a very complicated question, Ana Maria. I think how Washington D.C. feels right now depends on who you are.
Hmm.
I think I can give you the perspective of Democrats being out of power, a Democrat myself. It's a
Hmm.
rather unpleasant Washington D.C. for us right now. I think it's a Washington D.C. that has changed quite dramatically in terms of power being exercised. I think we have always seen, an executive branch who is, forceful but somewhat gentle on the institutions as it governs. And I think in Donald Trump's case, he's being very, very, very forceful. He is being testing every single limit. So Washington, in general, is not used to this type of focus and this type of test, limiting,
Hmm.
the guardrails as often as he is. So that's in general. In terms of how this is affecting the U.S., Mexico, and issues internationally, I think the world is feeling exactly what I just described to you globally. I mean, from regardless of whether it's been a Democratic or Republican president, I think the globe is used to a somewhat gentile, sometimes, aggressive United States. But right now, I think all the alliances, all the historical relationships that traditionally had been around the globe are being tested the same way that the institutions in Washington, D.C. are being tested because, the president, this administration is being aggressive in terms of negotiating trade deals, in terms of
Hmm.
national security, in
Right.
terms of testing everything. So yeah, you globally and in Mexico, Ana Maria, you're feeling what I feel every day, and domestically, which is, some people like it. I don't.
Now, in in the case of Mexico, it's been very interesting to follow President Claudia Sheinbaum because she has taken a position up till now, which I think is the right position, which is to not respond immediately to Donald Trump and not negotiate publicly with the president. But at the same time, if she doesn't do that, which is very different than Prime Minister Carney, who is very frontal and he's willing to confront Donald Trump. I think Canada perhaps may, in the long term, may be better off because they're confronted Donald Trump, or I just don't know what to think anymore. I don't, when people ask me what's the best way to negotiate with Donald Trump, quiet or, in his face, I just don't know what is the best strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's let's start with what the right strategy is. I think there's let's be aggressive. There's the let's capitulate as quickly as possible, and let's do everything that he asks us to do. But there's a fourth option, which is stay off the radar. And I think
Mhm.
I think if you look at the leaders around the globe, and a lot has been written about this. The Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico sort of stands out as one of the few leaders out there of a country that as important and also as complex as Mexico is to the United States, was one of the few leaders that actually doesn't have a personal animosity for that there hasn't been sort of this sort of very public fight between the two of them, whether that's a deliberate strategy, whether that's because something's coming like none of us know, but I do think generally speaking that she and Mexico are in the best possible position right now, which is not, again, nobody's in a good position, nobody has any sort of certainty, but not having the animosity between the leaders I think helps.
Now, this week, President Donald Trump had a huge win with the approval of this big, beautiful bill. Could you just explain what was approved this week and why it was so important for Donald Trump?
Yeah, Ana Maria. So the big beautiful bill, which is hard to say, but that's actually sometimes I remind people that that's not just a nickname that Donald Trump gave the bill. It's actually the official title of the bill, right? So it's painful to have to say it just because, just because it's painful and it sounds silly, but here we are. I think the bill in itself has a couple different components that are really important to Donald Trump's base. One is obviously the tax cuts, right? So the tax cuts across the board were incredibly important to the base, and they weren't just cuts, right? They're not new cuts. Essentially extending, the tax cuts that were going to expire this year, and making them permanent, which is very important to his base. The second part is that there were some new exemptions in the tax code, which is no pay on overtime and no pay on tips. I mean, there is some limitation, so it's not unlimited, but those were important to him because he was, you know, he promised those things to his base. And politically, I got to be honest, like they're brilliant when you think about it, because like who's against not taxing tips and not taxing overtime pay, and as well as some social security benefits. I mean, it's a great concept. So it works very well for him. The second part that's really important to him is all of the spending that there are on ICE agents, on CPB, on all immigration related. It's a huge amount of money. It's a huge amount of money that is being dedicated. ICE itself is going to be probably the second or third largest armed force in the world, right? It's going to be bigger than a lot of countries' militaries, so that's the size and scope of it. That's the part that they put out there that they say is important to their base, that they say is a positive thing to the economy. But on the other side, to get all of this done on America, they had to cut. They had to make major cuts to Medicaid. They had to make major cuts, to food stamps. A lot of programs that it's not just Democrats that rely on, right? So there's a lot of programs that were cut in order to pay for that. That I think may come back to haunt them. They set it up so they don't go into effect until 2027. So after the midterms, so it's the Democrats' job to remind people of what it was done. But I think there is a concern about the cuts, particularly Medicaid, that will impact rural areas, as well as all the SNAP benefits and all the food assistance programs that were cut.
So there's parts of this bill that clearly should that those of us who are in Mexico should be paying attention to. What parts of this bill do you suggest that we follow closely?
Yeah, so I think, so obviously, obviously from Mexico's standpoint, the big one is obviously all the enforcement money that is going into immigration, and that's important just simply because you're going to see an uptick in militarization type of efforts along the border. And it's not just necessarily an immigration policy issue, right? Like Mexico and the U.S. are each other's most important trading partners. And people forget that the big part of trade is actually stuff going back and forth and crossing the borders, right? So the more aggressive and inefficient that those borders or ports are, as a result of immigration enforcement, it affects trade. I also think, that the remittance tax and the involvement of the U.S. government more and more in remittances is hugely important. To Mexico, it's Mexico's largest source of foreign investment. And now you do have the US government not just taxing it, but also much more active in monitoring, much more active in pushing limits on people that are not in the US in a documented fashion, putting limits and making it more difficult for them to send money.
So, this whole, the also, of course, the attitude the president has, or the way they're treating undocumented people in the United States is continues to be shocking. Although there seems to be numbers to indicate that the number of Mexicans that are being deported or forcibly deported is not as big as we thought, or at least the Mexican government thinks it's not as large. So the at the end of the day, Mexico has always used or shown concern for migrants in the U.S. It just Mexican migrants in the U.S. It just seems that this time around they're kind of more once again trying not to confront Donald Trump with so many of these this behavior. I'm thinking about the Alcatraz detention center, Alligator Alcatraz detention
Yeah.
center in Florida. So, I mean, that's also interesting to follow very closely. Um, what is your, and I know this is a tough question because it's still it's for me it's still very confusing. I mean, what is your sense is going to be the outcome of this trade war? Because there was, some decisions were being made. Next week is apparently going to be key. No, in the next couple of weeks, it's going to be key for many of these countries. I mean, what is your sense? What's going to happen?
Yeah, well, Ana Maria, I think that one of the things that you can count on, with Donald Trump is you can count on new deadlines and extensions occurring probably for the rest of his administration, right? So those of us that follow trade and those of us that are trying to advise people and give them insight into, where we're going with specific countries, where we're going, with specific trade agreements, have found out the hard way that that this administration actually doesn't stick to deadlines, or like they change deals overnight. So I think the short answer is, where are we going? I don't think anybody knows. I don't think Donald Trump knows. But I do think that Donald Trump and this administration have focused on the power that they have to have discussions with various countries, not just focused on trade for trade's sake, right? That would be one question about the economies and what the effects of tariffs does to products and prices and inflation, et cetera. But they're actually also using it to leverage other things on it, right? From countries. They're looking for more, investment in technology to find fentanyl. They're looking for more help on immigration. They're using this as a leverage, which makes it really hard to see where we're going.
And of course, the U.S. economy has been doing quite well. I mean, there was pretty good unemployment numbers this week that made Donald Trump very happy. He's furious with Jerome Powell, who heads the Fed, the central bank, because he has not. They're not lowering the interest rates. So, are you surprised how well the economy is doing, considering how chaotic this all is?
Well, I mean, I think, how the economy is doing, it also depends on where you sit in the US, what part of the country, where you are in the economic factor in the economic ladder. So I don't think the economy is working well and perfectly for everybody. The economy is doing fine. It's moving forward. It's not gaining the sort of traction that I think everyone would like to see. Um, but having said that, you're absolutely right. I mean, every time we think, that there's going to be, either a threat of a recession or inflation's going to come out of control, we continue to be out of control. It just sort of stays steady. But it's also important to understand that, like, when the economy is sitting steady, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going in the right direction, right? It's been steady in the same spot for about 2 years, right? The stock market has been up and down. It's not as, it's not as steady as it has been with other administrations, but in general, we keep sort of tugging along. The problem is, the problem right now, which I think Americans aren't feeling because it's not immediate that you feel it, but the value of the dollar is actually lower today than it has been like 20 or 30 years, right? The bond market, which is countries buying US debt, is actually sliding a little bit, right? So those are things that I think macroeconomically people are really worried about. But on day-to-day basis, most people aren't going to feel that. But like if you're an economist, like those two issues are of concern. A weak dollar, right? A weak
Mhm.
dollar and having problems selling their debt, given the amount of debt that we just added to the economy is also worrisome. So
And
it's
and
not perfect.
and there is the issue of the debt, which will rise quite dramatically now that this bill has been this bill has been approved. Do you think do you think, and the reason why I was asking you about the US economy, because when the US starts sliding or has a slowdown, of course it affects Mexico enormously. Do you think that there will be a political impact for Donald Trump uh, in the next couple of years, and the Republicans especially, because of these decisions and these bills, and even the way they treat migrants? I mean, I'm just, it's shocking to see from outside how strong Donald Trump seems, at least publicly, and with his base.
Yeah, no, Ana Maria, I mean, I think that's obviously the million-dollar question. That's on every Democrat's mind. That is definitely on the mind of people that think this administration is going in in the wrong direction. People are looking for, for a spot for Democrats to take some control where they can push back, which they don't have now. The question of whether or not that occurs, is a complicated one. Primarily because every trend, every old rule, Ana Maria, that you and I, have grown up in politics knowing is kind of out the window, right? In the last couple of times. So it's like, it's hard to really put smart money in what's going to happen. But two things are usually true, right? Which is that, the first election cycle, for a party in power, they have a bad election cycle. Joe Biden actually defied that, so he didn't have a terrible midterm elections, but every other president has. So one, historically, Donald Trump, or whoever the person in power usually has a bad midterms, which I think helps Democrats. And two, the big beautiful bill, as it's called, the approval ratings of that are somewhere like 35% approval rating, right? So that it doesn't have an approval rate. A lot of times big pieces of legislation like this are just not popular. But if you add those two things, things would, smart people that follow politics would tell you that Democrats are likely to have a new year. Republicans would come right back and say, like, you're wrong because this, we set up the bill so that the majority of the effects of the bill aren't until 2027. A lot of the constituents, like a lot of the constituencies that are upset about what's in the bill, particularly the debt side, like they don't really vote in midterms. So there's all kinds of ways to analyze this, but the truth is that we're not going to find out till after the elections.
Oh, it's always great to have you on the show, especially now and the upcoming weeks, because I mean we did follow very closely what trying to understand what was going to happen with this bill, the big beautiful bill. Um, but there are really tough decisions that need to be made that include this trade war and how it's going to ultimately impact Mexico at a time where there already is conversations that there needs to be a renegotiation of the USMCA and not a revaluation. So anyway, there's so much to talk about and so much to quote unquote to look forward to. That's why I really appreciate you joining us, Ivan, today here on Living in Mexico.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Thank you. That was Ivan Zapien. He is a partner at Hogan. Remind me your Hohen Lois, right?
Levels.
Hogan
Levels.
Lois. Hohen Lois from Washington D.C. I really appreciate you joining us. We're going to go
Yeah.
to commercial break. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. You're listening and watching Living in Mexico. Don't go away. I'll be right back.